The committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the oversight and government reform is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. It's our job to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs and the GAO to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. Imagine beginning every month not knowing how much money you have and not being able to track what money has been spent. Personally, in our family, it's unthinkable. Yet, month after month, year after year, that's exactly where the Federal Government operates. The American people are periodically reminded of this when we talk about the upcoming debt ceiling. And yet, the debt ceiling seems to move not by hours or days, but by weeks and then months, and often nearly a year, as money is somehow found and consumed that was claimed not to be there. That's not entirely a shell game, but rather the reality that until they go looking for it, they don't know where it is. When they find it, they often don't know how much they have. It's unbelievable, it's unverifiable, and it's unaccountable. We have no idea how much money is spent and how much we owe. We have yet close approximations. And more, President Obama keeps asking American people to trust government and to give them more authority with your money. For all the promises of reform and modernization in government, the reality is the promises have fallen short, no reform has occurred, and in fact, this committee has found that it is harder and harder to get execution of existing accountability. As Chairman at this time, I have to remember that this is not a new problem. It is a problem exacerbated by new government programs. Certainly, the looming Affordable Care Act creates the likelihood that we will be administering over a large portion of our gross domestic product at a Federal level. In fact, later in this July session, we will be looking at whether we can secure the records of every American's taxes. I repeat, every American's taxes when they are put out as part of the Affordable Care Act. This is a large undertaking and one that involves huge privacy issues. Now, health care records and your income and financial spending wouldn't seem to be linked, except they were all linked by whether or not computer systems work. They're all linked by whether accounting systems work, and they're all linked by whether or not the system the government employs to authorize people to make entry, to oversee entry, and to analyze the actual current state, all is the same. So the accuracy of your health care, the protection of your privacy, and whether we can track tax dollars, all are effectively the same problem. But rather than looking at an individual who finds themselves with their entire health record on the Internet, or perhaps millions of veterans who find that their personal information was taken home on a laptop and somehow the laptop was lost, and as a result, personal information can be available on millions of Americans. In the case of the GAO's look and this blunt, straightforward analysis that this government is broken, allows us to see it quantitatively in dollars and cents. This is not to say that this problem began on this President's watch, but it is this President's watch, it is the ranking member's watch, and it is my watch. So today, we want to say to the American people, don't expect miracles, but do expect government to begin performing basic math better. We live in the 21st century. There are companies who today are trying to figure out how to reacquire tens of billions of dollars that are stranded overseas from their profits that did not exist, I repeat, did not exist when many on the dais came to Congress. Companies have been formed, accounting systems created, vast capability to analyze and be accurate to the penny and meet the requirements of public accounting have occurred with companies that did not exist a decade ago. If we can create great institutions from scratch, tilt them up, and make their information secure and available to 7 billion people around the world, and do it in the time that Mr. Cummings and I have served in Congress, then how is it that we are worse off, no better off, when it comes to government accountability than we were at the time that my ranking member and I came to Congress? That is part of what we will hear today, and I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing. And I want to thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for testifying today. I appreciate the work that you and your staff have put into the reports that form the basis for your testimony today. And I trust that you will express the appreciation of our committee for the very hard and excellent work. This hearing focuses on two areas that are the core of this committee's jurisdiction: government financial data and government performance data. In order to be efficient and effective, the government has to know how much money it has, how much money it is spending, and whether that money is being spent wisely. The Government Accountability Office performs an audit each year of the consolidated financial statements of the government, which are prepared by the Department of Treasury in coordination with the Office of Management and Budget. In January, GAO reported that it could not express an opinion on the audit of the government's books for fiscal years 2011 and 2012. This is not a new problem. GAO has not been able to express an audit opinion on the government's books since it started performing these audits in 1997. The Department of Defense is one of the main reasons GAO is unable to give an audit opinion. The DoD is responsible for more than half of the Federal Government's discretionary spending, but is unable to prepare auditable financial statements. GAO has included DoD financial management on its high-risk list in 1995. In its 2013 high-risk report, GAO said this, and I quote, "DoD is one of the few Federal entities that cannot accurately account for its spending or assets, and is one of three major impediments that prevent GAO from rendering an opinion on the annual consolidated financial statements of the Federal Government. Without accurate, timely, and useful financial information, DoD is severely hampered in making sound decisions affecting its operations." On the other hand, the Department of Homeland Security has made major improvements. For the first time, DHS received a qualified audit opinion for fiscal year 2012. This is the result of a concerted effort by the Secretary and other DHS officials to improve the Department's financial management. It is also the result of the work of this committee with holding the Department accountable through hearings and briefings. Fiscal responsibility is about more than just balancing books. It is also critical for the government to know whether the money that is spent is doing what it was intended to do. In 2011, the President signed into law the Government Performance and Results Act, Modernization Act of 2010. That law was sponsored by Representative Henry Cuellar, and it was approved on a bipartisan basis by this committee. The Act required GAO to conduct assessments of the law's implementation, and on June 26, GAO issued its report. GAO found that the government has made major strides through implementation of the law. John Kaminsky, a senior fellow with the IBM Center for the Business of Government, offered this conclusion as his takeaway from the GAO report. The key, quote, "the key story that stands out for me is that the conceptual framework of the GPRA, Modernization Act, and the actual use of its provisions, such as priority setting and data-driven progress reviews, are seen as effective by agency managers, end of quote. GAO also found a number of areas that need improvement. For example, GAO found that agencies are not doing enough to track issues that cut across agencies, such as climate change and food safety. I look forward to hearing GAO's recommendations for how the government can do better, both in terms of financial management and performance management. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. All members will have 7 days to submit opening statements and extraneous materials for the record. We now recognize our panel of witness and his other, well, guys, there's more than one witness. But we recognize the Honorable Gene Dodaro, who is the Comptroller General of the United States. And we ask the following GAO advisors accompanying Mr. Dodaro to stand and be sworn at the same time. And if there are any others, but the other ones I mentioned, please let me know. But Nancy Kingsbury, Gary Engel, Robert Dacey, Steve Sebastian, Asif Khan, and Chris Min. Is that complete? Would you please rise, raise your right hand to be sworn? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Dodaro, you have been here so often that to say, please bear in mind that your entire record will be placed in the record would be redundant, so I will dispense with that. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's audit of the consolidated financial statements of the Federal Government and also our assessment of the initial implementation of the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act of 2010. Now, as it relates to the financial management in the Federal Government, we reported 21 of the 24 largest departments and agencies were able to receive an unqualified opinion for fiscal year 2012 statements. However, as has been pointed out in opening statements, there are serious material weaknesses in internal controls and financial reporting that have prevented us from being able to give an opinion on the consolidated financial statements of the United States government. The three major impediments are serious financial management problems at the Department of Defense, the inability to eliminate intragovernmental transactions among Federal departments and agencies, and an ineffective process to compile the financial statements of the Federal Government. Now, DOD, OMB, and Treasury are all seeking to rectify these weaknesses, but our assessment is that much more work needs to be done in order to address these issues and put the Federal Government in a position where it can get an opinion on its consolidated financial statements. We were also unable to express an opinion on the Statement of Social Insurance, which covers Social Security, Medicare programs, due to the uncertainties associated with the estimates for restraining cost growth under the Medicare program. With regard to other areas we pointed out in that report, we also pointed out that there were internal control weaknesses and improper payments and computer security across the government, and made other observations or recommendations. Now, with regard to performance management, the Modernization Act of 2010, the initial implementation of setting up the requirements for the Act has taken place. The Administration has set interim cross-cutting goals. The agencies have set priority goals. They've assigned responsibilities as outlined in the Act for performance officers in the departments and agencies, and they're beginning to hold quarterly progress reviews, performance reviews that are required under the Act. However, there are a number of significant areas that we pointed out where there are remaining weaknesses and opportunities for improvement. First of all, we found little improvement in the use of performance measurements and informations from the survey we did for this work in 2012 compared to 1997. And so there's a need to really increase the use of the information and the usefulness of the information there as well. We also pointed out where there are areas where there have been difficulties in measuring performance that have yet to be overcome, for example, in grants and contracts areas. So there's a lot of room for improvement in actually developing better, more complete, and useful performance measures. We found there were missed opportunities and cross-cutting areas across the government where programs were included to be measured but not tax expenditures. And so the performance of tax expenditures needs to come under greater scrutiny as well as to whether it's achieving its objectives or not in assessing government-wide priority goals as well. We also found the law requires that there be a public website set up to increase transparency. That has been done, but the website can be improved greatly in terms of its usefulness, transparency, and we made recommendations that people more work is done assessing the needs of people in the Congress and the public to use that information to make it more transparent and useful to the American public. We also found little evidence of meaningful consultations with the Congress. This is a very important point.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, we found little evidence that were meaningful consultations with the Congress in this case and made recommendations there be better documentation. One of the main objectives of this Act, even though the original 1993 Act required consultations with the Congress, the 2010 Act was to increase those consultations and require them to be documented by the agencies in their reporting. And that hasn't been done to, we think, the intentions and expectations of the Congress. So we've made many recommendations in all these areas to OMB. They've agreed to implement all the recommendations, so we'll be tracking their progress in our future reports on these areas as well as on the consolidated financial statement. So just in closing, I would say, and I want to underscore, meaningful improvement in financial management and performance management will not occur without greater leadership on the part of the executive branch and rigorous oversight by the Congress. It's needed in order to have financial and performance data that are commensurate with dealing with the significant problems we have in the Federal Government, both fiscal, management, and performance. And I applaud the committee for holding this hearing, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and the Congress and the administration and bringing about meaningful reform. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for a series of questions. In your prepared statements, one of the things that and in the briefing that we received kindly before this hearing, one of the things that you note is that when government does business with government, Federal government, agency to agency, something that we want to encourage in a number of ways, they actually do a very poor job of tracking that. This committee has passed previously the Data Act, and it died in the Senate. Our belief is that it died in the Senate mostly because of pushback on recipient reporting, that recipients of grants didn't really want to be held accountable, but those were, and maybe that's not completely unfair, they claimed it was burdensome, but clearly that was one of the areas that we've continued to work on to try to make it more acceptable. But had the Data Act been passed, with government systems being required to have meaningful metadata so that, in fact, there's a transparency, would that have improved this government-to-government accounting?
Having data standards that are included in the Data Act and regular reporting would have been very beneficial to addressing these issues. And that information then can be and should be tied to the financial systems and the agencies and having more rigor in place. I'm very supportive of the Data Act that's been put forward. I commend the committee for its role in that area. I think without legislation it won't happen, and I think that that's very important and would be helpful in addressing these issues.
Well, I might note for the record that a previous OMB director, now in a new job, is beginning to see the benefit of that information different than when it was his task to do it without legislation. You mentioned the deficiencies in the government-wide website. Is part of that deficiency, in fact, that without meaningful structured data, you're really not producing rich data in an automated way, but rather posting to the website as though it was an advertisement. Not trying to belittle it, but isn't that a certain amount of what that website is manually grabbed information, posted to try to make people aware of what is going on?
Yeah, the website, if you look at it, there's a lot of information on it, but it's hard to find exactly what you need. And it's not as searchable, for example, as the recovery.gov website. And I think more effort needs to be put into making sure people understand how the public and the Congress and other people want to use the information. It's not very user-friendly.
Well, let me ask you a question, and you may have to go to one of your assistants. When we're looking at the 21st century, the word website versus data mineable database available to the public, isn't there a huge difference in which a website is fine for a novice to go search and hopefully find the form they need or the information they need? Well, if we were to mandate truly data mineable bases, then companies and innovators who want to create these Apple apps and so on could in fact mine that data, that public data, and make it available in very easy format at no cost to the government.
Exactly. No, I think there's great opportunities to make government data available to enhance the ability of people, researchers, companies, and others, the public, to use that information. But the one thing we pointed out, whether we're looking at usaspending.gov, Data Act, or data.gov, performance.gov, is the quality of the information and the reliability and accuracy of the data. That, I think, is paramount, and that always isn't really assured, Mr. Chairman, and that's, I think, a real limitation to. We can make a lot of data available, but if it's not reliable and it's not accurate, it's not as helpful as possible.
When we're trying to look for examples that do work, would one of those examples perhaps be where the FAA opened up the core data of where aircraft are within the system so that people could track their incoming flight with apps that were made available after the fact? That's my understanding, is both weather and FAA are examples of data that has become available for independent development.
Let me just consult. I'd have to get back to you.
Okay, I appreciate if you do that for the record, because I would like to the greatest extent possible, the public to understand, and we'll create a link to some of those examples if we can work with your staff. Now, you mentioned food safety. This is the Committee of Oversight, but it's also the Committee of Reform. Some years ago, the President noted that food was controlled by multiple agencies in rather obtuse ways. If I remember right, his example were where salmon were swimming affected where they were under the control of. And that, of course, that was live. And then when you get into various foods and food groups, you could be at the FDA, Department of Agriculture, a number of others. Should this committee consider consolidated food safety, a reorganizational plan that would make food a single point of accountability, whether or not it leveraged existing agencies so that the American people could see food safety as a single point of accountability?
Yes.
Thank you. I love a great witness.
Sorry.
For all of you here today, that's the example of a really great witness.
Right.
My time is expiring, but I mentioned in my opening statement the challenge of data accountability under the Affordable Care Act. I know that that's not the primary concern of this hearing, but for the GAO, is this not by definition next year's high risk? The fact that in 70 days we theoretically will implement the Affordable Care Act, and at that point this IRS data and a confluence of other information to exchanges not yet even up and running, and in some cases not defined, will become the law.
That's an area we're definitely going to focus on. I've been concerned. In fact, we have computer security as a government-wide high-risk area, and we've focused on that for time. We've looked at the exchanges. Some of them are going to have difficulties making sure they're established on time, which leads you to believe they may be taking shortcuts to be able to get up and running on time. So I think it definitely has all the characteristics of potential high-risk situation.
Thank you. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I just want to follow up on what the Chairman just was asking, Mr. Dodaro. Tell me what form, tell me how that has come about that you're looking at the Affordable Care Act and IRS. Tell me what form that's taking.
Yeah.
You follow me? I just want to know how
right.
that course of action started and what you're looking at.
Right. We've been asked to look at a number of areas on implementation of the Affordable Care Act. For example, we were asked by the Congress to look at the status of exchanges that were set up either by the states who are going to run the exchanges or the Federal Government's actions to set up exchanges for that, both for the general public, also for small businesses as well. And we've issued a series of reports on those areas. We've looked at some of the initial implementation issues at the IRS, and I'd ask Mr. Mim to come up and explain a little bit about what we're doing there. But we're going to be doing a little bit more work on this in the future.
Mr. Mim, is it Mr. Mim?
Mim, yes, Mr. Mim.
And would you tell us what kind of guidance, if any, you're giving to any agencies with regard to the Affordable Care Act?
Yes, sir. The primary area that we've been focused on in regards to IRS has been the extent to which they have been using a disciplined approach to risk management in understanding the risks that they face in order to implement their responsibilities under the Affordable Care Act, whether or not they've identified those risks, have risk mitigation plans in place, the right set of leadership structure on that. We made a series of recommendations to them about how they needed to strengthen that, and in particular how they needed to work better with HHS. Now, this was a year and a half, 2 years ago. We need to follow up on that work again and go back and make sure that the recommendations that we had have been effectively implemented. But the last time that we looked, which would be about 6 months ago, that they were making progress in those areas of understanding at least how they needed to manage risk in that regard.
And so when do you all plan to follow up to see whether they have been implementing those things? In other words, the status of your suggestions or your recommendations?
We have routine requirements in GAO that we have to follow up periodically on them. Obviously, given the interest of this committee, we'll make sure that it's the very highest priority.
Very well.
Yeah, we've had, Mr. Chairman, if I might elaborate a little bit further. One, we had a number of mandates in the actual Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act for us to do certain work. I'd be happy to provide a complete listing to this committee of the work that we've done so far and what our plans are going forward.
I'd appreciate that. Now, Mr. Dodaro, as your report notes, the Defense Department is responsible for more than half of the government's discretionary spending, but it has never been able to produce reliable financial statements. 20 years ago, in 1993, GAO issued a report with the following conclusion, and I quote, "In our opinion, efforts to address deficiencies and improve financial management have been slow with DOD." 4 years later, in 1997, GAO issued a similar report that said this, and I quote, "Longstanding serious weaknesses in the Department's financial operations continue not only to severely limit the reliability of DOD's financial information, but also have resulted in wasted resources and undermined the Department's ability to carry out its stewardship and responsibilities." Another 4 years later, in 2001, GAO examined DOD's plan for reliable financial statements and said this, and I quote, "This plan presents the military services and DOD's components stovepipe approaches to information financial management and does not clearly articulate how these various efforts will collectively result in an integrated DOD-wide financial management system." Yet another 4 years later, in 2005, GAO said this, and I quote, "To date, tangible evidence of improvement has been seen in few specific areas. DOD is still in the very early stages of a department-wide reform that will take years to accomplish." You see the pattern.
Yes.
Mr. Dodaro,
I've seen it firsthand.
Yeah.
Over the years.
Here we are in 2013, and you're still telling us again that DOD still cannot get a clean audit. Why is that? I kind of think the American people would be shocked that we can't get that done. What seems to be the problem? Is it a matter of will? Is it too big to account for? What is it?
Yeah, well, there's several different factors that we've observed. We've had it on our high-risk list since 1995, DOD financial management.
So it's getting ready to reach its 20th anniversary.
Yeah. There's a couple issues. One, they operated for many years and decades without a requirement to produce audited financial statements. The first requirement that was ever in effect was for fiscal year 1996, across the Federal Government. So they operated many years. So their systems were developed and still are in existence that aren't able to communicate with one another. They don't have common data standards across the Department, et cetera. So you have a huge enterprise that's operated without fiscal discipline for many, many years. Secondly, right after the Act was passed, I don't think that their commitment was anywhere near as strong as it was today. And I think then the Congress has become increasingly concerned and now has mandated that they be auditable by 2017 and their statement of budgetary resources by 2014. So Congress has gotten more involved, but it needs to stay more involved in these efforts. They finally have a good plan. They're focusing on budget data right now. So I think that originally the department managers didn't believe they needed audited financial data in order to carry out their responsibilities. So right now they focused on budget information, which everybody agrees they need and should have, and the existence and completeness of assets, which they need to carry out their mission. So I'm hopeful this will produce the results, but they have very serious problems, and it's not going to happen overnight and won't happen without continued focus.
Well, to the Chairman's credit and to the credit of this committee, I mean, we constantly try to concentrate on efficiency and effectiveness. And I guess I'm just trying to figure out how bad a problem is it. In other words, I mean, is it such a crucial issue that we may be losing billions of dollars and not even know it? You follow me? I'm trying to figure out. Yeah. And then I see my time is in.
Yeah. No, it's a very serious problem, and I think it undermines not only accountability but the operations to operate efficiently and effectively. There's reportedly about a third of the Federal Government's assets are at the Department of Defense.
So if we didn't accomplish, if we were to accomplish anything to be a part of our legacy for being in Congress, if we got that done, that would be major.
Exactly. And I'm trying to do my part to get it done before my tenure ends, and because I think it's one of the most important things that we could collectively do.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
For the record, Jane, you've got what, over 8 years left?
I have 12.
12 left?
12 and change. Yeah.
This is not that optimistic, says some of us up here.
I know, but I'm being realistic given the track record. I said before, I didn't say at the very end.
Well before we'd like to hear. But for the record, the gentleman from the ranking member did repeatedly say that Department of Defense is the largest discretionary, but it's actually, isn't it true, it's really the third largest spender compared to Health and Human Services and Social Security. And if you compare Medicare, Medicaid, obviously that's larger. And the question I want to make sure gets on the record, not that that's true, because I think that's a clear fact, but didn't Health and Human Services and Social Security, to a certain extent, get qualified or unqualified audits, even though they had some major gaps?
Yeah, they received an unqualified audit on their financial statements. There's a separate financial statement for Social Insurance, for Social Security and Medicare.
And they flunked big time.
That we did not give an opinion on.
Great.
Because of the uncertainty of achieving the cost estimates that are expected in the Affordable Care Act. I mean, the trustees pointed out the uncertainties, the CMS actuary pointed it out, the auditors for HHS pointed out, and us. So it wasn't just us, and there are a lot of uncertainties there.
Yeah, thank you, and thank the ranking member. I think it's one of those areas in which we know we have to work at DOD. We also know we have to work on entitlement oversight. Mr. Mica.
Thank you. Welcome back, Mr. Comptroller. Your report indicates that only a little over a third of the Federal managers have actually conducted performance evaluation of their programs. I think 37%. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that was in any one of their programs over a 5-year period.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, having been here a while, you see these agencies and government in general spinning out of control, not getting a decent evaluation of their performance, or even their agency being auditable. We really can't perform an audit of the Federal Government or most of its agencies. Isn't that also correct?
Well, most of the agencies cannot get an unqualified opinion, but the big ones, the DOD and DHS, cannot.
Yeah. The worst, you say, is DOD, one of the worst.
Yes.
I think the Chairman referred to others that have spun out of control. The problem you have, though, is you don't get these agencies to respond. I have passed specific provisions, I know some at least 3 times since 2002, to get certain things done and performed, and the agencies ignore law. Now, we do have you, we have the Inspector Generals and OMB. It appears to me that you've got to tie performance into some penalty or some reward, and I'm wondering if we should give OMB or someone. Congress obviously can't do it or doesn't do it. We're hit and miss. We get our appropriations done. This committee actually is the one who is evaluating some of that performance because we're conducting a continual oversight. But you have those that authorize programs and then that fund it. So I'm wondering if OMB might be the agency, or if you had any suggestions as to who you could get to wield a hammer and, I guess, withholding funds. They don't seem to, we call them in and they ignore you. You just don't get the attention. It's surprising, too, with the military, because usually the military works on commands, and they are usually one of the most responsive. But, again, we are not getting their attention. Any ideas? What about having OMB being able to withhold funds or some penalty?
I think OMB would be a good place to start, along with the Congress and particularly the appropriation committees. What I think is fundamentally broken is the incentive. Right now, if you want to stop a Federal program or you want to curtail it, the onus is on those to come up with evidence to do it. There's no evidence-based approach to this. In other words, a program should have to demonstrate they're having positive effect in order to get continued funding.
That's sort of a self-evaluation, too. It's not an evaluation in comparison to how a task or a responsibility could be accomplished by some other means, either the private sector or by some more efficient method. It's my guess that we probably done overpayments in the billions, multi-billion-dollar area because of this. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah. Well, we point out the improper payments as a material weaknesses across the Federal Government. There are 4 agencies with 10 programs that still aren't reporting.
We're looking at multi-billion-dollar.
Well, the latest estimate was $107.7 billion in improper payments for fiscal 12. That's not complete. Not everybody's reporting. Yeah. So it's a huge problem.
It's an astounding number. And again, we have no means of bringing these agencies under control. Congress is I mean, again, we haul them in, you question them, you put caveats and report language into to appropriations language, you modify authorization, and still things don't get done. So I think we've got to look at some hammer and maybe giving OMB some ability to withhold funds. That does get people's attention. They know they can mess around with Congress because half the time we're doing CRs, and you get sort of a general, the last 5 or 6 years, you just get a general appropriation, and they don't pay much attention to us. But someone has to gain control of bureaucracy that's spun out of control.
Yeah, one other suggestion I'd have, and the Government Performance Results Modernization Act of 2010 requires OMB not to list programs that aren't effective. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think listing is nice, but I think we need to give them some teeth to bite.
Well, I agree, but I think it's a platform for this committee to then hold hearings and have them determine why other programs where you have some evidence of not being effective aren't on the list. But I agree with your fundamental issue. I'm just saying there's another avenue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. I certainly I appreciate the work you're doing. We've had a chance to work together in the past, and I think you're doing the right thing at GAO, and I appreciate the work of your staff as well. Unfortunately, in this committee, sometimes, and in Congress generally, the degree of oversight that we conduct as a Congress is dependent on blameworthiness. In other words, we lurch from scandal to scandal, and it's the same when the Republicans are in the majority versus the Democrats. We were guilty of the same thing. We seize upon issues to conduct oversight based on our ability to embarrass the other side, or if there's a president of the other party in office, then the party that has control of this committee generally goes after issues that can put that administration in a bad light. And so that leads me to great concern on this issue, because this has been so widely fumbled over administrations for a long, long time. Our ability to get this data correct and then make it transparent so that we can exercise meaningful government oversight is greatly inhibited. So I'm worried because there's no blameworthiness here that we up here won't focus on this at all. That we'll have this hearing and then we'll keep on. We'll go look for some other issues that will get us headlines where this work is really meaningful, and it will, if we get it right, it will greatly help us on a lot of issues across the board. You know, I'm greatly disappointed still over our inability to get DOD to get their act together. It's a huge amount of our resources going to the Defense Department, and it boggles the mind that the NSA can tell me how many times Aunt Margaret called, you know, Aunt Matilda, yet I can't get a verifiable audit from the Defense Department on how much money they're spending. Just blows my mind. And you know, I actually think that sometimes the complexity and the pushback that we get from DOD is purposeful. They don't want us to be able to track what they're spending. I know now in this age of sequestration that they're sort of changing their attitude a little bit and coming up with some new ideas. But you know, I would just ask you to stay on that piece, because that's a black hole right now. We cannot figure out what they're spending. And it's as important to them that we get that information as it is to the American people and to the taxpayer. Because if we assume that they're still getting barrels of money, we're going to cut. We're going to keep cutting and cutting and cutting, and we won't know when we get to the bone with the Defense Department if we continue to operate in this way. We have a sense that they're spending a lot of money, and we'll just keep cutting. And you see that in the votes of the House. More and more members are willing to cut the Defense Department because there's this unverifiable sense that they've got huge resources there. And if we continue to cut away, I think at some point we do get to the bone. But what I want to ask you is about government oversight. We have a core responsibility here in Congress to make sure that we conduct meaningful oversight of executive operations, the bills that we pass on a regular basis. And you know, during this sequestration, we're getting a lot of pushback. Members on this committee trying to do oversight, whether it's, you know, drug interdiction coming out of Colombia, whether it's what's going on in Afghanistan, you know, what's going on in Syria, Lebanon. Our ability to conduct oversight is being denied because of sequestration. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the importance of Congress fulfilling their constitutional responsibility to conduct meaningful oversight.
I think rigorous oversight by the Congress is of paramount importance. If you look at the history of our high-risk list, which we do for this committee and the Senate, most of the areas that have come off the high-risk list have come off in large part, because of continued congressional oversight. And the preparations for the last census, there were 12 hearings that were held, and I can give you many other examples. But unless there's top attention by top officials in the executive branch and rigorous congressional oversight, these difficult problems will not get solved. I mean, we have ample evidence of that. I'm convinced of it. But it can't be just one hearing once a year where they can just say, okay, well, we'll go up there and sort of answer the questions one time. There has to be sustained series of hearings with interim milestones of progress that would be assessed. Because if you set, and part of the problem with the Defense Department, they've always had, long-term goals. We'll get there in, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. Now the Congress has set some interim goals, and I think the series of hearings could be held on why they're not meeting the interim goals if they don't meet them. And I think that lays the groundwork for more meaningful congressional oversight. But unless that happens, I'm not that optimistic.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McHenry.
And actually, I want to follow up on what Mr. Lynch asked. It's a solid line of question. Now, there's a different emphasis today. We're talking more broadly on our side of the aisle on government spending, and the other side of the aisle is about DOD. It's just more of an emphasis. But we all share the same concern. I think, Mr. Lynch, when you talk about the wider bipartisan agreement now, that we've got to look at defense spending as well. We've got to make sure that every dime we spend there is appropriate and actually meeting the objective. Now, that for a long time has been driven by your side of the aisle being adverse to defense spending, and our side of the aisle embracing it. Now the realities are setting in that we actually need to make sure that every penny, regardless of where it is in government, is very, very well spent, and not just simply honoring our commitment to defense. And I certainly appreciate and concur with you on that. We also are on the Financial Services Committee, and what we see there is with rule implementation, you don't have harmonization between the CFTC and the SEC, for instance. And I'd like to thank the GAO for the report they produced as a mandate within the Jobs Act on the utilization of Reg A, which is a smaller dollar offering, so that businesses can raise up to $5 million. This was well utilized up until maybe a decade or two ago, where companies would raise up to $5 million utilizing this option. And then what we found was in 2011 you had one offering, and the SEC didn't look at this and say, hey, maybe this is a problem. We need to make sure that businesses can get the capital they need. And so the question I have for you is, do you see, and based on your experience, based on the work that you put together, that congressional oversight has led agencies to actually meet their goals? Is that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there are many examples of doing that. I mean, and so I think that's critical in order to do that, either through hearings, requirements, and authorization bills and appropriation bills, et cetera. That's a very congressional oversight can bring about many constructive changes and help agencies do achieve those goals by eliminating, in some cases, barriers, by creating legislative vehicles, and by strategically making good investments where the agencies need to make those investments. Absolutely.
How can we enhance collaboration?
I think, one area I mentioned in my opening.
Between agencies.
Oh, between agencies.
Yeah.
That's an issue. Now, the Results Act of 2010 requires more consultation across the agencies. And what one of our findings were in this recent report was that when the cross-cutting goals are now set, and there are 14 interim ones that are set by the administration, all the agencies that should have been involved in those cross-cutting goals weren't involved. And so we identified, some additional opportunities for collaboration. I think the congressional challenge is where those cross-cutting goals cross multiple committee jurisdictions. And I would recommend, have recommended, there be more joint hearings between selected committees in the Congress, both within each chamber and perhaps even across chambers, because otherwise there won't be a totality and a good picture to look at over a period of time.
Well, we hear you on that. And on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, we've done, I think, a pretty good job of actually teaming up with other committees, and even at the subcommittee level, making sure that we have joint hearings. That's more so where it's done.
Right. And we've also published the best practices guide on how to promote more collaboration among the agencies. It's particularly important when you have these interagency groups that there's clear responsibilities, there's a clear structure, they set goals, they set milestones. A lot of times we find that interagency groups are created, but they really don't set rigorous milestones. Now, sometimes Congress has done that legislatively for them, either require these groups to be formed or to set particular goals for them. So that's another avenue. But I'd be happy to provide this committee our best practices report on collaboration and provide any other support we can to help you in that regard.
Well, we appreciate the work that the General Accountability Office, the GAO, does, and certainly appreciate the good folks you have working for you and behind you today, and behind them that are in that dungeon-like bunker that is the GAO headquarters.
It's a sturdy building.
Quite sturdy. Intended to be the National Archives, if I remember correctly, an archives facility. So we need to get you a little more natural light over there, but we certainly appreciate the light you shine on important agencies. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Dodaro, I just want to say that having been over in that building, it's filled with a lot of warmth from your workers, so that makes up for the lack of light. Yes, yes.
We will continue with the theme, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. Mr. Dodaro, in your written testimony, you noted that Federal entities reported estimates of improper payments amounts that totaled $107.7 billion for fiscal year 2012. Does that include the DOD's estimates as well?
Some of the DOD estimates aren't included in there. There were problems with their estimating process, I believe, so OMB did not include them, and some other agencies in there. There are also some big programs that aren't in there yet, Congressman Duckworth. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the TANF programs, the Direct Loan Education program's not in there yet, so that estimate's not complete.
Okay, and that's what I was trying to get to, because DOD is responsible for more than half of the government's discretionary spending, and yet in your testimony you highlight the improper payment estimates and the shortcomings of DOD's financial management. If DOD can't even properly estimate its own improper payments, doesn't that heighten the government's overall exposure to waste, fraud, and abuse?
Yeah, definitely.
And some of the specific weaknesses that GAO has identified include DOD's failure to do the following things. They have not yet developed an appropriate sampling methodology for estimating improper payments. They have yet to produce a statistical estimate for its largest program, the DFAST program, which is, of course, personnel pay, commercial pay. And also, they have failed to maintain key documentation supporting improper payment estimates. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. How concerned are you with DOD's failures in these areas?
Well, I'm very concerned, and I have been for years. I mean, that's why we put them on our high-risk list in 1995, was to try to, shine a light on this problem, both for the Congress and to underscore to the executive branch how concerned we are about the situation over there. And I think it not only do you not have good accountability, but they're hampered in their ability to effectively make good, timely decisions over there because of the lack of good, reliable information.
So what do you think is keeping them from developing some of these processes that are in place at other agencies, such as the statistical estimates and some of the tools that are being used? Why is the DOD unable to do this?
Yeah, well, they're very, as you know, they're a very decentralized, large agency, and there needs to be central direction and management and leadership there to really bring this problem home, because a lot of the data crosses across multiple the parts of the department in order to be able to pull the information together. For example, DFAS makes the payments, but you have the personnel records in another part of the department. They don't match. It can't be reconciled appropriately. So there hasn't been in the past. They're trying to do it now. But really top-level management attention and authority that can enforce the change across the entire department.
So until some sort of centralized management or process is established at DOD, I mean, knowing that that's not there, how is DOD doing with regard to cutting waste and fraud by reducing the amount of improper payments, even if it's very decentralized in how they're going after it?
Yeah. Let me bring up, Asif Khan is focused on DOD financial management. I've given him the unenviable job of trying to make sure there are improvements over there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Congressman Duckworth. That problem is going to continue to happen. It really has to be fixed at the localized level where the transaction originates, and it's going to be some time before they begin to address that problem.
Is the improper payments also tied to, this committee had testimony in previous hearings on just not keeping track of how we're paying contractors, what we're being charged by contractors is not accurate. Is that all part of this, especially overseas, Afghanistan?
Yes, it is.
It is, okay.
Yes, but on the waste, fraud, potential mismanagement issues, DOD occupies about 1/3 of the 30 areas on our high-risk list, because it's not only financial management, we've got inventory management, contract management on there, weapons systems acquisition, and all those areas are susceptible to problems, and that's why, we have them on our high-risk list.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize myself. Mr. Darrow, thank you as well, and for your whole team for the work that you do on it. Trying to find out what we do know at this point and what we can know and what we don't have a capability to find out. So let me just run through a couple of things. Can we at this point identify a list of all government programs? That we have a list of, we know the agencies, but of the actual programs that exist in those agencies. Does such a list exist that we can actually track and go through and compare?
Not yet in any complete, reliable way. I'll ask Mr. Mim to come up, but the Modernization Act of 2020 required OMB to come up with such a list.
Right.
And they've produced now a list for each major department and agency just recently, within the last month or two. Many other agencies have yet to report their list. We're looking at the list to make sure each agency was left to decide the definition of a program. Okay. So I don't know if there's consistency yet across what's there or not, but it's in process now. It's very much needed, but I don't believe it's complete yet, Chris.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, there is, the list is out there, or at least the first part of the list is out there. There is not comparability across agencies. One of the things that we're evaluating is under a mandate that we have under the Modernization Act to periodically report, is we are looking at that list and we'll be reporting to this committee and others on it.
Okay. Will that list include a number of employees and the administrative cost of the program, or just an actual list of the program itself?
At this point, sir, you're a bit of ways from being able to get to the programmatic cost data on that. Okay. We're just working, or OMB is just working on, let's just identify what government does in a consistent way.
Okay, one of the limitations we've had when doing the overlap and duplication work is the lack of cost information, budgetary information for many of these programs. So, once you get the list, I mean, that's really the next thing that needs to be put in place.
Okay, step one, to know every building we have in Washington, D.C. and who's actually in there.
Right.
Step two is a list of all the different departments that are within it. Step three, getting a chance to get a list of all those programs. And then we have to move to how much is the administrative cost for that program? How many employees are dedicated to that program? Do we have any ability at this point to then take to that program, what are the metrics that you're using to find out if this is effective? It may have a great title for the program, but does it actually do anything, and is it accomplishing anything?
Yeah.
You had mentioned several points about metrics and standards and evaluating. how far away are we at this point, or is there any requirement that's out there that we actually get metrics for these different programs?
Well, there's requirements in the Government Performance and Results Act, but our work basically shows that it's very uneven across the Federal Government. There may be metrics, but some of them are not outcome-based, where you know the results of the program. You might know program activity. For example, how many people have been trained, but you won't know exactly, how many people actually got a job or, the results of that. So I think that's a work in progress, but we point out in our reports much more needs to be done in measuring performance, both outcomes, and then evaluating performance with program information that looks at trends and metrics over time and why you're falling short, how can it be improved. So there's a ways to go until you'd have uniform, good, not only metrics, but good results across the Federal Government.
What is needed from us? Is that an OMB issue that they need to work out? Is there a statutory requirement that needs to be put in place to help provide a push to say we've got to have some way to be able to evaluate effectiveness of programs and to even know how many beneficiaries? I mean, you mentioned we know how many people are trained for a job, but we don't know how many people actually got a job at the end of it. I'm not even sure, when I've looked at some of the programs, I can even find out how many people were even trained for a job. It's just, this is the program that exists, no definition, no staff, no metrics, no number of beneficiaries, anything.
And the real question is, even if they did get a job, did that training help them get the job? Or maybe many of other factors that had an influence on their ability. And so unless you have that information, you don't know whether you're getting a good return on your investment. But Congress can do a lot more, both through the consultation process under GPRA, where they're required to be. I've recommended to the congressional committees that you outreach to the agencies and say, hey, you're supposed to be consulting with us. Let's talk about these things. These are the measures we'd like to see put in place and improvements being made. Then there's the oversight process and legislative process. Chris, anything else?
No, I think the consultation is a particularly important opportunity for this committee and other committees. I mean, these consultations should be starting this summer on the goals that will, on the strategic plans that are to come out with the President's next budget, as well as the agency priority goals. Those are the 4 to 6 top priorities that each agency is to establish. They have to consult with the Congress on those, and that's a very important opportunity to try and get a common understanding about what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to measure that performance. Another big opportunity, and this is really one of the great insights of the Modernization Act, is it requires quarterly meetings to be held in the agencies on each of these agency priority goals, and then that to discuss where are we, what do we need to do to improve, and then rigorous follow-up to take place after that. It's modeled after what happened in New York City in the early 1990s called CompStat, and it's been used in CityStat and StateStat, the so-called STAT model. That data is to be published or is being published on performance.gov. That provides another great oversight opportunity, because those are the priorities that the agency has established, and so you can really follow up with them and say, where are you in terms of achieving those goals?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Davis just walked in. Mr. Davis, I think you're up to bat next. Are you ready for questions on that? Or you want to defer and we can come right back to you, because you just walked back in. So let me do this. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being back with us. Thank each one of you for your hard work. I know that it's the support team that makes a big difference, as you will acknowledge. I'm troubled that we have hearing after hearing after hearing, and really nothing happens. When you talk about over $100 billion in really unaccounted for spending, it's 1/10 of our deficit. I mean, when we put it in a perspective, I mean, that's 1/10. We're sitting here trying to scramble as members of Congress to find $86 billion, and you've found more than that just in funds. I set up new offices, and when I did that, I found I went out and negotiated with governments to make sure that we didn't have to pay for leases. And so I'm sitting there scrimping for $250 or $500 or $1,000. So it's very frustrating when I see it, and I know you empathize. One of the things that came up that gave me great concern, though, is we started sending rental payments to one of those vendors that never was authorized by us. We didn't even give an amount. So they just started making up an arbitrary payment. We wouldn't have known about it unless the government agency called us and said, I thought we were giving you this space for free. and we're paying for it. And so this unaccountability is across, is systemic. And so I want to get to your earlier point. You talked about motivations and performance, and really, if we don't control the purse strings, we don't have any control. And if we don't have a motivation where if you do a bad job, you lose your job, or if you do a bad job, you get your budget cut, how do we fix that? This is not, I would agree with my colleague opposite, Mr. Lynch, this is not based on this administration or the prior administration. It's a systemic problem within government. So how do we fix that? And is it true, and I'll ask this last one and let you comment on both of those. My understanding is that until about 10 or 15 years ago, we controlled probably 95% of the spending. Now, congressionally, we're only controlling about 35%. Is that a true statement?
Yes, that's true. I mean, that's because most of the spending right now is through mandatory programs, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security, where the only way that Congress can control that spending is by changing the requirements of who's eligible and what type of payments that are made. And if you add interest on the debt to those three things, mandatory spending's taking up about 66% or so.
Have we exacerbated the problem, though, by allowing agencies to when we did away with earmarks, we allowed them to reprogram, we authorized the spending, and so they can move it around and have little penalties there as well? Have we exacerbated the problem with that?
Well, I don't think necessarily that would have increased the problem, because they're supposed to report what they're changing in most cases, and the Congress has an ability to inquire on that issue. But
we have the ability to acquire, but not really stop. And that's what I'm finding is when I call these agencies, they'll talk to me. They've got their congressional liaison, and they'll talk to, but they're not afraid. Would you agree that most agencies are not afraid of Congress anymore?
Well, I don't know about that. It depends on if somebody's just leaving the witness table, and you ask them that question. But I do think there needs to be more teeth in place. To go to your very first question, what I've seen be effective is when we point out a problem, many times Congress will fence the money. That means saying, okay, we're going to appropriate this money, but you can't spend it until we get a report from the GAO or some other things that's convinced us that you have a good plan in place, that you fixed earlier problems. So Congress has effectively used that. It could do it much more, and I think it would be more appropriate. So Congress has the power of the purse strings. It has to be willing to use it effectively to leverage change.
Well, can your staff report back to us on what we can do to highlight it so we can put more teeth into it? Because I think it's time that the American people, they want teeth, and we would look forward to your help there.
Okay. Be happy to do that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, General.
Thank you, Congressman.
I want to talk to you about two things. I know my colleague, Ms. Duckworth, asked some questions about improper payments. But in the previous subcommittee, in the last 4 years, we had a series of hearings on improper payments. What's the estimate, the global number every year we think fall into that general rubric, General?
The latest was $107.7 billion. But that estimate, in our opinion, is not complete. There are 4 agencies and 10 programs that are not yet reporting, including the large temporary assistance for needy families. Then there were another 6 agencies where their estimates were not good enough for OMB to report.
So it's north of the official figure?
I believe so.
Yeah. If we were to say it was rounded out $125 billion a year, would that be a fairly safe rounded out number, do you think?
Given how these numbers vacillate, Congressman, I'd hesitate to give a guess on that.
Well, if we just took that number for a minute, we could take 107 too, but times 10, that number of improper payments over a 10-year period exceeds sequestration. Is that not correct?
Oh, sure. Yes.
And How well do you think the government is doing in trying to address that program? I mean, in theory, if you could get it to zero, which ought to be the goal, we'll never quite attain that goal, but you give yourself a stretch goal, incredible things can sometimes happen. How well would you assess, General, the Federal Government is doing in putting in place mechanisms to bring their respective numbers down?
I'd say there's a fair amount of activity, not much results yet.
One example, of that total, the lion's share is Medicare fraud. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah,
about $50 billion a year?
Medicare, Medicaid, yeah. Right.
About $50 billion a year?
That's 40, 50, yeah.
Do you believe that there's evidence that U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, of which I believe there are 99, are sufficiently seized with this mission to bring that number down through prosecutions, investigations, and prosecutions?
Well, I know that the HHS Inspector General's office works with them. I mean, they really focus on that area. I don't have a basis for answering that question beyond knowing and seeing, there are prosecutions in some cases. So I really don't have an empirical evidence to answer that question.
Okay, well, I'll give you a data point. One U.S. Attorney's office in New England, just one, is accountable for identifying and helping to recover $3 billion of Medicare fraud. One. There are 98 others. Now, not all of them may be that big, but one of the things I'd urge you to look at is, as part of this, are U.S. attorneys' offices sufficiently seized with this mission? Because if every one of them replicated the zeal and the commitment of talent that this one did, we could bring that $50 billion number down considerably. Mr. Chairman, we were just talking about improper payments and some of the work this committee has done in the last 4 years on a bipartisan basis to identify the problem and to try to get Federal agencies seized with this mission. I was pointing out, Mr. Chairman, that if you round it out at $125 billion a year, and that could be a low figure actually, but we'll take that one, times 10, it exceeds sequestration. So, I mean, without raising anyone's taxes, without slashing any investments, here's low-hanging fruit in a sense, and it just seems to me, for want of a champion, for want of some focus, we're not making the kind of progress we need to be making.
Yeah, and I think, your point, we will look into the U.S. Attorney's priorities on that.
That's one, yeah.
But that's one end of the problem, is trying to get it back once it's gone out the door. The other side is preventing it. And I think, for example, we've had a recommendation that they establish surety bonds up front with new providers. So if you find payments later, the government has some money that it can offset, up front. That hasn't been fully implemented yet as well. So there are a whole range of things.
There's, in addition to management, and my time's about to run out, but the Chairman and I co-authored a bill, FITARA, that is now part of the Defense Authorization Act, and hopefully will become law. And it's designed to provide some rigorous tools for Federal agencies to upgrade their management of IT, acquisition, maintenance, personnel management. The Chairman identified that, for example, in the top 26 Federal agencies, there were over 250 people with the title of CIO, which means this, right? No one's in charge, no one's accountable. And our bill is designed to try to at least have one main person called CIO who's infused with responsibility, authority, and accountability. But the other thing behind this bill, though, is IT. If we're going to have to live with sequestration or something like it for 10 years, if you don't simply want an absolute contraction, a zero-sum game, IT has promise, if properly managed, to help us on so many fronts, one of which is this too. So I hope we can also look at how is IT being deployed so that we're not making the errors that are part of this total.
We're looking at that.
Okay.
We're looking at that. But you're absolutely right. And I'm very supportive of the provisions in that bill.
I just end with this, that again, this is a subject this committee has done some real trailblazing work on, I think, for Congress. It's not a sexy topic, but it has real promise. And I would hope, General Dodaro, we could work together in trying to create some metrics for Federal agencies to, because without metrics, it's aspirational. And we need to move from the aspirational to the productive. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would say that our legislation really is as close to the swimsuit edition as you can get in legislation. So I'm not sure I go with the gentleman that there's no appeal to it. I think it's pretty attractive.
I stand corrected.
Mr. Benzvilio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. our Attorney General, right?
Comptroller General.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here today. But, you know, after listening to your testimony today, I can't help but remember a story a constituent told me about, it's called Government Accounting, How You Tell the Story. Perhaps you've heard it, but just bear with me, about the three gentlemen walking down the street and it starts to rain. They each have $10. So they pooled their money together to go and get a hotel room for the night. And the hotel manager later discovers that he overcharged him $5. So he calls over the bellhop and wants the $5 returned to the three gentlemen who pooled their money together to get the room. On his way up to the room, he pockets $2, and he hands each of those three gentlemen back $1. They each originally contributed 10, minus 1 is how much?
9.
9, 3 times 9?
Yeah, 27.
Plus a 2 in the bellhop's pocket.
Right.
Where's the other $1? That seems to be the question. And I find it startling how much taxpayer money we seemingly lost track of in the Federal government.
Yeah.
Many government programs are on autopilot when it comes to their budget. Every year it is assumed that they need more money. With zero-based budgeting, which would force agencies to justify every penny of taxpayer money they get to spend every year, help agencies account for the money that they receive.
Pardon me? I'm not sure.
Would
I'm still trying to figure out where the $2.
$1.
$1, right.
Right. Yeah, well,
we'd be thrilled if there's only $1 that was unaccounted for.
But in government accounting, it could add up to billions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, definitely.
And my simple question, when I explain that, it seems to be that's how government agencies account for their money. It's how they tell the story. But we all know 25 plus 2 plus 3 is 30. So we account for the money. But it seems the government doesn't understand that. And they seem to lose a lot of money. And it seems to me that if we got rid of the waste and abuse, we could probably afford a lot more or pay down our national debt. But my simple question is, would zero-based budgeting, which would force agencies to justify every penny of taxpayer money they get to spend every year, help agencies account for the money that they receive?
I think that that effort's been tried a bit in the past. I think it has some potential value if it's implemented with a lot of less administrative sort of burden. But the idea, though, of justifying the programs by showing good results, I would support that ahead of time. In other words, you have to justify the program's achieving its objectives with some empirical data that's been independently validated, and I think that's the way to go.
Zero-based budgeting, wouldn't that do that? Justify what you're going to spend the money for?
If you have good information. I mean, part of this is you can send people to go through all the requirements. They'll generate volumes of information, but it may not be accurate, it may not be good information, it may not be convincing. And so it embarks on a big process where at the end of the day, Congress is still left, even though that may be generated from a zero basis, with a lot of information that really doesn't help them make a decision on how to fund the money. And so that, to me, it would be better to focus on having them demonstrate results of the programs and justify the expenditures for the results that they're receiving. Right now, that doesn't happen. If you want to try to curtail a program or limit it, you have to prove it's not working and have data to do that. That's exactly the opposite of the way it should be, in my opinion. I think that would be a more effective way and more efficient way for Congress to go about making its decisions.
Thank you very much.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Perhaps I could restate part of his question, which is not as much on this hearing, but I think it's germane to the gentleman from Michigan's question. If Congress, in its appropriation, were to have all appropriations not subject to CR unless specifically shown. In other words, when we authorize something and we authorize it for 1 year, and as you know, when we go into CRs, which happen often, essentially we keep money trapped in things which should have expired. If we changed our bias toward you must specifically have essentially an X next to something that says this continues unless amended automatically, you could end up with perhaps in discretionary spending, and even some that would be considered less than discretionary, you could end up with perhaps as little as 80% of the budget subject to CR, where you'd have an automatic cut to all these programs. So instead of a CR representing a continued resolution substantially at the same rate, unless you agree, you would have a cut automatically in all those programs with no replacements, unless in fact the budget process used those funds with new appropriations. Wouldn't that move the bias toward what we would call automatic sequestration that is predetermined, something that before sequestration we perhaps never thought of?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more, and I'll give you a definitive answer. Offhand, I would say that it holds promise to do that. The other thing is that there ought to be mandatory, my opinion, mandatory sunset provisions for every Federal program with a positive reauthorization act approach. What you're suggesting kind of goes in that direction, and for that reason, I think it holds some promise.
Thank you. And you've looked at this in the past. Perhaps if you could dust off some of that and put those two together so that this committee could look to our brethren on appropriations with a mind toward current appropriations, anticipating, if you will, sunset where appropriate under appropriations, and then to the other authorization committees, the sunset inherent in authorization that could put this into play. Yes. Thank you. With that, we go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, how are you?
I'm fine. Nice to see you, Congressman.
It's good to see you. GAO reported in its audit of the government's consolidated financial statements that it gave a disclaimer of opinion on the statement of social insurance for 2012, 11, and 2010 because of significant uncertainties primarily related to the achievement of projected reductions in Medicare costs. Some of those uncertainties relate to whether projected savings from the Affordable Care Act will be fully achieved. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
But there are other uncertainties related to Medicare savings that contributed to the disclaimer of opinion, such as estimated reductions in payment rates for physicians. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's, as you know, probably for the last 10 years, if maybe not longer, Congress has always waived those provision cuts that should be in place, which are about, last year, I think, estimated to be about a 31% reduction.
And so I get to my point. I want to put this in perspective. GAO is not saying that savings won't be achieved under the Affordable Care Act. You are saying that the amount of Medicare savings in the future is not a certainty. It's not absolutely known.
That's correct. And I might point out, Congressman, it wasn't just GAO. The Social Security trustees, which includes the Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of HHS, said there were uncertainties and reported that with the estimates, as well as CMS's actuary and the auditors there as well. So there's a general consensus. But you're right. We're saying it's uncertain, and because it's uncertain, there are alternative estimates that were made also, which show a swing of about $10 trillion over this period of time on a $27 trillion original estimate. So it's potentially significant.
And even so, there are those who would, in fact, try using that point to suggest that the Affordable Care Act is not going to save money when, in fact, if I'm correct, it already has achieved significant savings. For example, In February, the Department of Justice and HHS announced that they had achieved $4.2 billion in Medicare fraud recoveries. This is the highest three-year return on investment in the history of health care fraud abuse program. And I guess it's basically due to new tools to crack down on fraud and new ways of looking at it and ferreting it out. Is that correct?
I'd have to get back to you on that issue and supply something for the record. I will do that.
Okay, but bottom line, I mean, we are certain in a real sense that the Affordable Care Act has provided for savings, and we can be fairly certain as we project that we're going to see additional savings as time goes on. Is that pretty close to how one can view what the data has shown?
Yeah, our focus was on the future projections for the program and what the assumptions were and the basis for those assumptions. That's what's led us to the uncertainty issue and others that have looked at those areas. We have not looked at the counterpoint that you're raising right now, so I don't have an analytical answer for you on that issue, but something that we can take a look at.
We'd be pleased if you'd do that, and thank you very much. And I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Yes. For a question. My staff tells me that recovery is based on legislation from 2006 that increased the audit. Are you speaking of some other aspect in the Affordable Care Act that would have led to that recovery increase?
Well, the legislation was done 2006, so we were already privy to having it, and the Affordable Care Act, of course, makes use of it. And so we still see the savings.
I don't understand how the Affordable Care Act makes use of it. The Medicare, in other words, the Affordable Care Act hasn't taken effect, and the audits that are leading to greater recovery, I think, are coming out of that effort by Congress. They're both good efforts when it comes to trying to control cost. I want to make sure the record is clear, and I think that Mr. Darrow can make it clear for us where he thinks that savings or recovery has come from, what efforts and what statute.
Yeah.
And if I might, Mr. Chairman.
Of course.
Just as we cannot be sure of how much savings there would be, we don't have any reason to suggest that there will be no savings. And so I think what the Comptroller is saying, that we haven't had enough experience yet to be able to make that determination, and that's what he will look into.
I look forward to discovering that with you.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on a question that Mr. Lynch was asking earlier, talking about the importance of congressional oversight, how folks were able to make a difference. One of my great frustrations is that we seem to sometimes be Republicans against Democrats or House against Senate as opposed to Article I versus Article II. Tell me about the effectiveness of oversight in the years that you've had a chance to watch it. Has it been Article I doing oversight over Article II, or has it been, as Mr. Lynch suggested, Republicans doing good oversight over Democrats and Democrats doing good oversight over Republicans, but not necessarily houses of the same party doing good oversight over their executive branch president?
Yeah. Over the years, I've seen a variety of oversight techniques that fall into all the different categories that you talk about. The most effective is when Congress is united in its oversight over an executive branch function or activity, and even when there is support, from GAO or even OMB in some cases on the need to make improvements, when there's a consensus where facts have been developed, there's a clear record that there's a problem that's sort of unimpeachable, kind of a problem statement, people may disagree on how to solve the problem, but at least you have the facts. And I think those type of oversight vehicles are the most effective.
Does it take two houses in Congress doing oversight to achieve those goals, or can you do it in a unicameral way?
You can do it in a unicameral way unless the solution's rooted in legislation that needs to be put in place. Then, obviously, you need both houses involved. But a lot can be accomplished without legislation.
Well, as you go through that high-risk list and you look at things that have been accomplished, you do see the effective list of things that could be done strictly within an administration, those things that require congressional activity. My recollection is we don't do nearly as well on those things that require congressional action to get them done. Let me talk about Medicare for just a moment. I put that doc fix in the category of things I tell my constituents back home. If I tell you I'm going to solve this in years 8, 9, and 10 of the 10-year budget window, you should just ignore me altogether. The question is, what am I willing to do this year to make things happen? I tell my friends in the physician community that they should stop lobbying for the doc fix. They should let those cuts go into effect, and they should let my mom and dad begin to lobby to have the doc fix fixed, because at the end of the day, when you reduce the payments the physicians are receiving, it is reflected in the quality of care that my mom and dad on Medicare receive. Thinking about effective oversight that changes things, you have any examples in the time that you've been leading where the American people have led in getting a change implemented? I always think about catastrophic care and Chairman Dan Rostenkowski back in the day having his car rocked by angry seniors, and guess what? That got wonderful results here on Capitol Hill. Have you seen the American public being the partner of GAO in good accountability?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think the example you give, and the other one is when the premiums were raised on Part B. During that period of time, there was a huge backlash, and so the people were there. Also, I mean, another example, I mean, just at the GAO, we have a hotline where people can call in from the public and suggest areas where they think there's fraud, waste, and abuse. And we, for ones that we find that are credible kind of tips, we follow up on and save money in a couple cases. I mean, so the public can be better informed, and I think if they are better informed, they can be very helpful in providing the type of oversight that you're speaking about.
And if I were to call CMS today and say, you know, my mom and dad received a $100 bill, charge they doctor they never saw, couldn't possibly be a legitimate charge, I'm pretty sure they'd tell me that they're working on billion-dollar fraud cases and they don't have time to look into my $100 fraud case. Is there a threshold as the public calls in with those tips for all that you have to do, with the limited staff that you have to do it, what rises to the level of?
Yeah, well, we'll evaluate it. We wouldn't want to do something where we spend more money than what we potentially could save on those areas, you know. But, you know, I would say to CMS, we spend the money $100 at a time. You know, we need to take a look at everything.
Well, when we talk about trying to have effective government and efficient government, I just want you to know how much fun it is for me to watch your team behind you as these questions come out and you answer them. It's not just one head as a subject matter expertise that's nodding behind you. It's 4 or 5 heads, all of whom know exactly what's going on and say, yes, this is where that is.
Well, thanks for that feedback. I find that encouraging, because I don't
usually see that camera shot there.
I don't usually find out till after the hearing how well I did. So it's good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I believe the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spears, next. No, I'm sorry, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. One of the challenges to evaluating whether agencies are duplicating efforts is the fact that until recently there was no inventory of agency programs. OMB is now required to publish a list of all agency programs, and they just released this first list in May. The list of agency programs can be found on the website, performance.gov. Do you believe that requiring agencies to provide information about what programs they have will help Congress and the public hold agencies more accountable?
Yes, definitely. And that will even be enhanced better if we get the complete list and it's accurate.
Okay. One of the significant improvements made by the GPRA Modernization Act was the establishment of performance.gov. It is a government-wide website that will allow the public to access information about government performance. Do you believe this has improved the transparency of information about agency performance?
I think it's a good start, but as we point out in our report, there are a lot of opportunities to have that website become much more effective in helping promote transparency, accountability, and by becoming more searchable, user-friendly, et cetera. So it's a beginning, and I think a lot of the efforts that have been legislated by the Congress over the years, USAspending.gov, recovery.gov, the performance.gov, is important and helpful. And I would encourage the Congress, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, to think about ways that that can be even improved further, and the Data Act would require that.
Also, GAO issued a report last month titled Managing for Results, Leading Practices Should Guide the Continued Development of Performance.gov. And one of the points that this report makes is that moving forward, OMB should increase its outreach to stakeholders. GAO uses Maryland's Governor O'Malley's performance website, StateStat, as an example, and I'll quote, "Following the initial creation of the state's performance reporting website, officials in Maryland analyzed the website's performance metrics to get a sense for how people were assessing the site, as well as the information they were searching for. They also employed usability testing to collect insight into the navigation and content of the website. From these insights, they identified the need to make information on related state programs and resources more easily accessible through the website, which is now reflected in its design. Do you feel that OMB evaluated the lessons learned from state and local websites such as Maryland's StateStat or Boston's About Results, or is there something OMB should be doing to improve performance.gov?
I'll ask Mr. Mim to answer that.
Okay, I see he jumped up there.
Yes, ma'am. The OMB was certainly aware of these other websites. As to whether or not they did a rigorous evaluation, the answer to that is no. In that one of the things that we recommend is, as you pointed out, is that they look at those websites, they look at howto.gov, which is the government's, the Federal Government's best practice guide for government websites, and make sure that they're consistent with those standards there. The key thing that they had with performance.gov, as you mentioned, it has an awful lot of information in there, a lot of very valuable information on there, but it's really at this time set up for inside baseball. That is, you have to be a Fed looking for other Federal information. It's not very forward-facing to citizens or to the Congress. That's the next step that they really need to take.
I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I will.
I'm very familiar with the Maryland system that she just talked about because Governor O'Malley was my mayor and now, of course, my governor. And one of the things that the system did bring was accountability. We were able to track, the performance of government, how effective and efficient government was being. But you see value in that, though, right?
No, yes, absolutely, sir.
Because before that, you didn't know what trash wasn't being collected, what things were not being addressed. Now you could actually say, okay, in Zone 3 of the police department, we have X amount of things going on. This was a response, and basically they would flash it up. I mean, we could come in as members of Congress or anybody, sit there and see exactly how government was functioning. And I don't know how much with regard to costs that it went, but regard to effectiveness and the use of the taxpayers' dollars, I thought it was a very good thing on the part of the governor. But go ahead.
Yes, sir. In fact, a few moments ago, we were talking about how under the Modernization Act, it took the model that's been used in Baltimore with CityStat, StateStat that they used, and that's now a Federal requirement, and that type of information has to be available on performance.gov as well. We evaluated the Federal efforts on that and actually looked at it from two different perspectives. First is that the question at each time as you've moved up the stat model from CompStat to CityStat to StateStat is, does it scale? Governor O'Malley had a great line when he became governor of Maryland. He said it was a bigger ship but smaller rudder, and when he was figuring out how he changed government at that level. And so we were looking at that at the same level at the Federal level, is do these STAT meetings scale? Do they work at the Federal level, and do they work for cross-cutting programs? We found it does scale. That is, that Federal managers and leaders of agencies, and this is a leadership strategy, are using them. What we did not find, or that we're looking forward to finding as we do additional work, is are they actually using them to coordinate cross-cutting programs. As you know, the extent in Maryland, the beauty of that is the governor also set up his priority goals for the state, and those were actually which brought together a variety of state programs. Those are reported on the website. You have BaseStat, which brings together various jurisdictions and levels of government to talk about the health of the Chesapeake Bay. So this is a very powerful device as a leadership strategy if it's actually used to drive performance.
Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You talk about savings in Medicare. In 1990, after 25 years, Medicare cost 12 times more than the original projections when it first passed. Now, the costs on Medicare have quadrupled since 1990. So, and Medicaid has a similar history. All these Federal medical programs have had the Congress has always received very low ball estimates on the front end, and then the costs have just exploded. And already I've read articles saying that the so-called Affordable Care Act, which I refer to as the Unaffordable Care Act, the cost projections are 2 or 3 times when we originally passed. But I noticed, I'm sorry I had to be in another committee and I wasn't here for most of your testimony, but in your testimony, Mr. Tadeo, you say the Federal Government was unable to demonstrate the reliability of significant portions of its consolidated financial statements. And then you say another place that our work has found that the information provided to Congress is not always useful for congressional decision-making because the information was, quote, not clear, directly relevant, or sufficiently detailed.
Right.
And then I look at the back page of your report, and I see almost every agency, the opinion expressed by the agency auditor, almost all of them say unqualified. I'm not an accountant, so I'm not really clear. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah. For 21 of the 24 departments and agencies, they got a unqualified, clean opinion. So they're fine. Where you have problems at DOD and DHS and another agency did not get clean opinions. But DOD accounts for about over a third of the Federal Government's assets.
I saw that figure, 34%.
Right, and over 20% of spending on the part of the Federal Government. So it's a huge obstacle to getting an opinion on the consolidated financial statements. There's a lot also of activity where agencies have to do business with one another, have transactions. Treasury can't net those out effectively and balance the statements. In fact, they have to add in a $20 billion net sort of plug figure in order to make the statements a balance. And then the government-wide statements aren't effectively reconciled to the audited financial statements of the agencies that you're holding there in your hand. And so there's a discrepancy and inefficiency in how they, or ineffectiveness of how the statements of the consolidated statements of the Federal Government are compiled. And so that's the reason for the differences in the statements in that listing of agency audits.
And there's a deadline for the Department of Defense has been given a deadline of 2017, is that correct?
That's correct for full auditability. 2014 for an audit of their statement of budgetary resources, which would account for how they account for their budget.
All right. Well, let me ask you something else. We always hear, I read so many different articles about these unfunded future liabilities. And I see all these figures that are way up there in the mega trillions. Do you feel like we have a good handle on that? Where are we headed with these unfunded future liabilities for all the different things we promised the American people?
Yeah, basically, in addition to doing the audit of the consolidated financial statements, we do long-range simulations of the Federal Government's budget, and our conclusion is while the Budget Control Act and the American Taxpayer Relief Act provided some help in bringing down the deficit, that long-term, over the next, sort of 70-year period, and maybe even shorter than that, the Federal Government's on a long-term unsustainable fiscal path that right now, debt held by the public is at 73% of gross domestic product. Historically, the 40-year average has been about 39%. The demographic wave and the main reasons for the unsustainable path are changing demographics. Between now and 2029, every day, there will be on average about 10,000 Americans turning 65.
Right.
They'll be hitting the Medicare program. So we're going to go into this demographic wave. Healthcare costs, while coming down a bit, are still rising faster than gross domestic product. And the combination of those factors, I mean, the trustee estimates predict the Medicare trust fund will exhaust in 2026. Social Security trust fund will be exhausted in 2030. The disability component of the Social Security trust fund will be exhausted in their predictions 2016. We're showing, unless something happens now in the short term, the annual deficit's coming down from where it was in the past several years, which is a good thing, but we still have a deficit which is adding to the cumulative debt. So, we're going into, some of our projections show between 2028 and 2034, under any scenario, we potentially, unless changes are made, will have debt held by the public higher than 100% of gross domestic product, which means we'd be, owing more than we're producing the entire economy. We've only hit that. The historic high was during World War II, which is 109%. And so, I mean, I'm very concerned about the future financial path that the Federal Government is on. Now, we report that every year, these statements, and then we do updates every 2 years. We've actually got now an accounting standard put into the consolidated financial statements that requires a fiscal sustainability projection and model, which is included in this report. So the Administration agrees that we're on an unsustainable path, and so does CBO.
My time's up, but I heard in a meeting just this morning that Turkey, for instance, has a debt to GDP ratio of 35%. And now, we have this $17 trillion debt, and I think a $15 or $16 trillion economy. And, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And at any rate, and we keep spending money like there's no problem, or like there's no tomorrow. Thank you. But I really appreciate the efforts that you're making in that regard, and the way that you're trying to be a Paul Revere about this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Thank you once again, Mr. Dodaro, for your outstanding leadership. I'm sure sequester is impacting you as well. And if there's one agency that pays for itself over and over again, I would suggest it is your agency. What's the impact of sequestration on your agency?
We've been reduced in staff size about 14% since 2010. Now, of course, that was earlier than sequestration, but sequestration compounded that. So we're at our lowest staffing level since 1935.
Your lowest staffing level since 1935?
Yes, yes.
And how has our budget grown since 1935?
Well, quite a bit. And the government's a lot bigger than it was since then. Fortunately, we've been able to handle it by downsizing, so I haven't had to lay anybody off or furlough people, but we're just not, have enough staff to get to all the requests in a timely manner that we have. So I'm hopeful this year we'll do well. Last year, we returned $105 for every dollar spent in GAO, over $55 billion in documented financial benefits as a result of our work, let alone all the work we do to inform the Congress for oversight purposes, and that we had over 1,400 other non-financial benefits, changes in laws, et cetera, that have helped improve public safety and improve management.
Okay. In your report, you reference the lack of accountability in the Army's payroll system. In fact, you say the Army and Defense Financing Accounting Service could not readily identify the full population of payroll accounts associated with the Army's $46 billion active duty military payroll because of these deficiencies. Does that mean that the Army doesn't know how many people it's paying for?
I'll ask Asif Khan, who's been focusing on this.
That's correct. At times, the Army does not know exactly how many people they're paying because of the lack of systems and lack of processes and controls.
Does that mean that the Army is not able to reliably match a soldier's personnel file to their payroll file to make sure that they are being paid the correct salary?
That's correct. That is a condition there.
So maybe we should alert everyone who's serving in the Army that they should check their payroll stubs very carefully, because they could be being paid the wrong salary.
That's correct. There could be overpayments and underpayments based on our experience and the work that we have done.
I mean, this is pretty outrageous, isn't it?
This is not what you expect.
All right. You've also identified that certain intergovernmental accounts were not in agreement to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, despite the fact that OMB and Treasury require CFOs of 35 significant Federal entities to reconcile on a quarterly basis their intergovernmental activity and balances with their trading partners. Are there any consequences for the failure to perform these year-end reconciliations?
No meaningful ones, no.
Okay. So if a CFO of a major corporation failed to reconcile their books, presumably they would be fired and face action by the SEC. But because they're doing business with the government, they don't have to reconcile their books, and there's no consequence. Is that the reality?
That's reality. That's exactly where it is. And this is why I think there needs to be more rigorous congressional oversight. I mean, in fact, I think, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, in about 14 cases, the CFO said they don't even know why. They're not even given an answer.
Can you provide the committee with those companies and those CFOs?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
And I really think that this is pretty outrageous. And if we're doing business with companies that can't reconcile their books and refuse to do so, then why are we doing business with them? And there should be consequences to not complying with the requirement to reconcile their balances with their trading partners. What would you recommend as a penalty?
Well,
loss of a contract, $1,000 a day? I mean, what would be appropriate?
Well, I think there has to be some link to the agency's appropriation process in order to do that. Now, that becomes a tricky issue, but my first recommendation is that you start with congressional oversight, make them explain it, and give them a deadline in which they have to rectify the problem. Part of the issue right now is there's not enough pressure on them to cause them to do this. Treasury tries to cajole them and to work with them and to support them, but there really isn't enough, in my opinion, congressional pressure. I'm also trying to make sure that it becomes a higher level of attention within the administration as well, but then there has to be some penalties in place as you're talking about. But that part, I can provide something for the record on what we found to be effective.
Would you also provide it to my office?
Yes.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because of your work on this issue and your leadership, I am going to yield my time to you for continued questioning.
You have a great future with this committee. Mr. Dodaro, I've got just a couple of wrap-up questions on this time. One of them is following up on Ms. Spears' question. Now that there's no longer a circuit city, I'll use them as an example. When I was in business, I did tens of millions of dollars with Circuit City. Their receiving system was such that they would receive 8 boxes one day and 2 boxes the next day. They would record the 8 boxes with 2 short, and then the next day when they received the 2, they'd put them in inventory and never count them against the 2 they reported short. So over a period of years, I ended up with millions of dollars of money they didn't pay me, and we were constantly showing proofs of delivery and so on. Now, that Circuit City was easy to do business with compared to the Federal Government. So one of the questions I have is, within this report, these plugging in of numbers, isn't some of it inherent with these contractors delivering and the frustration of how the government receives and accounts for the goods? In other words, doesn't it take 2 to end up with this problem?
Oh, definitely. Yes, yes, yeah, for sure.
Okay, I wanted to make that clear because I think the gentlelady was right that we do have to be less tolerant, but I think we have to be less tolerant of both sides if we're going to fix this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a classic example, was that the DOD systems, their legacy financial management systems, don't even identify who their trading partner is. So it's, you know, that's a big part of the problem is DOD, and so that's a classic case of where you can't necessarily automatically fault the other party because the counterparty is potentially causing most of the problem.
I appreciate that, and we'll try to work on both sides. In closing, on page 25 of your report, where it's Appendix 1, it says Chief Financial Officers Act, and it shows the audit results by agency. And so, for example, Commerce got an unqualified agency audit by KPMG. And just to give you one more, Ernst & Young did not give a unqualified audit on Health and Human Services, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, I want to get all of them in here somewhere. I don't see them. Okay. The fact is, next to most of these unqualified and not unqualified, with the exception of Justice, Labor, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and National Science Foundation, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Office of Personnel Management. Those are all the exceptions, or in the Department of Energy. With the exception of those I just named, all these others have a check mark that I want to make sure we say what it means. It says agency auditor reported material weakness or noncompliance. Now, I oversaw both private and public companies, so I'm very aware what my audit is, and I know that there's always something that can be improved. But when it says material weaknesses or noncompliances, that's really not truly an unqualified audit. That's a unqualified except for there's this qualification. Isn't that true?
Well,
these are not clean audit results.
Yeah, these are a separate reporting that's required under the Federal Financial Management Improvement Act, where the agencies have to demonstrate that they can record things at the standard general ledger transaction and at transaction levels, and that their systems will comply with accounting standards. And what this basically means is that the agencies compile their year-end financial statements, many using manual procedures and documentation, but their systems are not up to standards in producing timely, reliable information throughout the year.
Well, let me put this into terms the private sector might understand, and you correct me if I'm wrong.
Steve.
Yeah. For example, at Commerce or Defense, any number of these agencies that have these unqualified but material weaknesses. One, material weakness may mean that fraud can go undetected. You might have a balance sheet that's accurate, but you may have been ripped off. That proper accounting for whether people actually put in time or don't put in time, they get paid, and you know how much they got paid, but they may not have actually done the work. All of those are examples, or some of those are examples of material weaknesses in that, yes, you've given us a financial statement that shows where you are, how much you spent, and how much you have, but you haven't actually told us whether the money's flying out through the back door through waste, purchases that are paid for on products not received. Those are all material weaknesses that can be and are likely included in many of these reports. Isn't that true?
That is correct. Essentially what the unqualified opinion on the financial statements tells you is that they have a process in place to produce a set of financial statements at year-end that appropriately account for the activity in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. It does not speak to the condition of their underlying internal controls.
Okay, so I think for the public, at the close of this, I want to say as Chairman that I look forward to us having all the agencies, including the Department of Defense, have unqualified financials. But it actually bears little, it's only a starting point for accounting for every penny for the American people so that we know it is actually being exchanged in return for the value that was agreed to. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's exactly correct. And actually, the original legislation, the Chief Financial Officers Act, goes to that very point about having timely, reliable information, good controls, and the audited financial statements are only a step, a tool to achieve that longer-term or more complete goal.
Well, I thank you for your testimony today. It's been extremely valuable. I won't say that it's as optimistic and uplifting as we'd like, but as always, you give us the truth, even if it isn't what we'd love to hear, and we stand adjourned. Thank you.